when desperate cowboy Ezra Callahan hired a mysterious girl to clean his crumbling cabin. He thought he was simply buying himself time before losing everything to foreclosure. But Clara Whitmore carried secrets in her carpet bag that would either save them both or destroy what little hope he had left. What miracle had he unknowingly invited into his home? The gunshot echoed across the empty prairie like a death sentence. Ezra Callahan lowered his rifle and stared at the wolf lying motionless near his chicken coop. 3 chickens dead, and winter was still 2 months away. He couldn't afford to lose any more animals to predators, but he also couldn't afford to waste bullets on every threat that wandered onto his land. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and something else. Something rotten. Ezra followed his nose to the barn where he found his prize bull, Thunder, lying on his side. The animal's breathing came in short, painful gasps. Foam covered his mouth, and his eyes rolled back white. "No, no, no," Ezra whispered, dropping to his knees beside the massive creature. Thunder had been his father's bull, worth more than everything else on the ranch combined. Without him, there would be no calves next spring, no hope of rebuilding the herd that disease had already cut in half. Thunder let out one final breath and went still. Ezra sat back on his heels, feeling something break inside his chest. The silence stretched around him like a burial shroud. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "A ranch without livestock is just empty land, son. Empty land doesn't feed a family." But there was no family to feed anymore. Sarah had died of fever 3 winters back, taking their unborn child with her. His parents had passed the year before that. Now it was just Ezra and a piece of ground that seemed determined to kill everything he tried to raise on it. He stumbled back to the cabin, boots heavy with mud and despair. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Another thing he didn't have money to fix. Inside, dirty dishes covered every surface like archaeology layers of his failure. Clothes lay scattered across the floor where he'd dropped them. The smell of sour milk and unwashed bodies made his stomach turn. Ezra caught sight of himself in the cracked mirror above the wash basin. Wild hair stuck out in all directions. His beard had grown long and tangled, filled with bits of hay and dirt. When had he stopped caring what he looked like? When had he stopped being human and become something that just existed? His stomach growled, but the cupboards held nothing except some hard biscuits and a can of beans with a dented lid. He'd eaten beans for supper every night this week. The thought of choking down another spoonful made him gag. On the mantel, his father's photograph stared down at him with disappointed eyes. James Callahan had been a proud man, clean-shaven and strong, with hands that could gentle a wild horse or deliver a calf with equal skill. What would he think of his son now? "I'm sorry, Pa," Ezra whispered to the empty room. "I tried to keep your dream alive, but I don't know how anymore." The bank notice lay crumpled on the table where he'd thrown it yesterday. Or was it the day before? Time had started running together like watercolors in the rain. The words were burned into his memory anyway. Final notice. Payment due in full by October 15th or the property will be seized. October 15th was next week. Ezra sank into his father's old chair and put his head in his hands. The leather was cracked and worn smooth by years of use. It still smelled faintly of his father's pipe tobacco and the saddle soap he'd used on his boots every Sunday after church. Church. When was the last time Ezra had been to town? When was the last time he'd spoken to another human being? Mrs. Patterson had stopped by a few weeks back, but he'd pretended not to be home. He couldn't face her questions, her pity, her offers of help he was too proud to accept. Pride. That's what had gotten him into this mess. Pride that wouldn't let him ask for help when the first cattle got sick. Pride that made him refuse his neighbor's offer to buy half his land for a fair price. Pride that kept him isolated on this failing ranch instead of finding work in town like a sensible man would do. But what work could he do? He was a rancher, not a store clerk or a railroad worker. His hands knew cattle and horses, not ledgers and machinery. At 32, he felt too old to start over and too young to give up. Thunder's death changed everything. Without a bull, The remaining cows were worthless except for meat. He could sell them, pay off part of his debt, and try to start fresh somewhere else. The thought made his chest tight with something that might have been relief or might have been terror. A knock at the door made him jump. Nobody ever came out here anymore. For a wild moment, he wondered if it might be Sarah's ghost, come to tell him it was time to join her. But ghosts didn't knock. He opened the door to find Mrs. Patterson standing on his porch, holding a covered basket and wearing an expression that meant business. Behind her, the sun was setting orange and red across the prairie, painting everything the color of fire. "Ezra Callahan," she said, pushing past him into the cabin. "Lord have mercy on your soul." Her eyes swept over the disaster of his living space, taking in every unwashed dish and discarded piece of clothing. Her nose wrinkled at the smell, but she didn't comment. Instead, she set her basket on the table and turned to face him with hands on her hips. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" "I eat," he said defensively. "Beans from a can don't count as proper." "When did you last wash? When did you last speak to another human being?" Each question hit like a physical blow. Ezra wanted to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. What defense was there for the truth? Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "Oh, Ezra, what would your father say if he could see you now?" "He'd say I was a disappointment," Ezra replied quietly, "just like everyone else does." "No," she said firmly. "He'd say you were hurting and needed help. And that's exactly what I'm here to offer." She opened her basket and pulled out fresh bread, still warm, and a jar of soup that smelled like heaven. Ezra's mouth watered despite himself. "There's a girl in town," Mrs. Patterson continued, ladling soup into a bowl. "Clara Whitmore. Lost her whole family to consumption last winter. She's been doing washing and cleaning for folks, but winter's coming and she needs steady work." "I can't afford to hire anyone," Ezra said, but his stomach growled loudly enough to betray him. "She'll work for room and board and $1 a week. That's less than you'd spend on supplies to keep yourself alive." Mrs. Patterson handed him the bowl of soup. "And frankly, you need someone to make sure you don't waste away to nothing before spring." The soup was the best thing Ezra had tasted in months. Real vegetables, tender meat, herbs that made his tongue remember what food was supposed to taste like. He found himself eating faster than was polite, but Mrs. Patterson just smiled and cut him a thick slice of bread. "I don't need a nursemaid," he said between bites. "No, you need a miracle," she replied. "But sometimes miracles come disguised as practical solutions." As if summoned by her words, another knock came at the door. Could this day hold any more surprises? Through the grimy window, a small figure stood silhouetted against the dying light. Not Mrs. Patterson's usual confident posture, but someone hesitant, uncertain. Ezra wiped soup from his beard and opened the door to find a young woman clutching a worn carpet bag like a shield. "Mr. Callahan?" Her voice carried the soft accent of someone from back east, but her clothes told a different story. Patched dress, mended shawl, boots that had walked many hard miles.
"I'm Clara Whitmore."
Mrs. Patterson said you might have work. She was smaller than he'd expected, probably no older than 25, with auburn hair pinned back severely and eyes the color of winter sky. But those eyes held something he recognized. The hollow look of someone who'd lost everything and was still figuring out how to keep breathing. Behind her, a horse and wagon waited in the yard. Mrs. Patterson sat on the driver's seat, trying to look innocent and failing completely. "I brought her out so you two could meet properly," the older woman called out. "Seemed only right." Clara's cheeks flushed pink.
"I'm sorry."
"I told her I could walk to town in the morning, but she insisted." "It's fine," Ezra said quickly. Something about her embarrassment made his chest feel tight. "Come in, both of you." The cabin looked even worse with Clara standing in it. Ezra saw it through her eyes. The chaos, the smell, the evidence of a man who'd given up on himself completely. She didn't recoil, though. If anything, her expression grew more determined. "You'll want to know what I can do," she said, setting down her bag carefully. "I can cook, not fancy but filling. I can clean, mend clothes, tend a garden. I helped run my father's house after my mother passed, so I know about keeping accounts and managing supplies." "What happened to your family?" The question slipped out before Ezra could stop it. Clara's face went very still. "Consumption took them last winter. First Papa, then my brothers, then Mama. I was the only one who didn't get sick." She paused. "Sometimes I wonder why." The pain in her voice was so raw that Ezra felt it like a physical blow. He knew that particular agony, the guilt of surviving when better people hadn't. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Thank you." She straightened her shoulders. "But I'm not looking for pity, Mr. Callahan. I'm looking for honest work. Mrs. Patterson says you need help around here, and I need a place to stay before winter sets in. Seems like we might be able to help each other." Mrs. Patterson climbed down from the wagon and joined them inside. "Clara's been staying at the boarding house, but Mrs. Miller can't afford to keep her on much longer, and Clara can't afford to pay rent without steady work. I have a little money saved," Clara said quickly. "Enough for my keep until I can prove my worth." "No," Ezra said, surprising himself. "If you're working, you get paid. Room and board plus $1 a week, like Mrs. Patterson said." Something flickered in Clara's eyes. Relief, maybe, or hope. "That's very generous, sir." "It's fair," he corrected. "Assuming you can stand living in." He gestured helplessly at the disaster around them. Clara walked slowly through the cabin, taking inventory. She opened cupboards, peered into corners, ran her finger along dusty surfaces. Ezra held his breath, waiting for her to change her mind and flee back to town. Instead, she turned to face him with a slight smile. "I've seen worse." "You have." "The boarding house where I've been staying has 12 people sharing 2 rooms. And before that," she shrugged. "Let's just say I'm not afraid of hard work or poor conditions." Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together. "Wonderful. I'll leave you two to work out the details." She headed for the door, then paused. "Clara, there's a spare room at the back of the house. It's not much, but it has a bed and a window." After Mrs. Patterson left, an awkward silence settled over the cabin. Clara stood in the middle of the chaos, still holding her carpet bag, while Ezra tried to figure out what came next. "I should probably show you the room," he said finally. The back room had been his parents' bedroom before they died. He'd closed the door 3 years ago and never opened it again. Now, turning the handle felt like disturbing a grave. Dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight streaming through a small window. Iron bed frame stood against one wall, stripped of bedding. A small dresser and washstand completed the furniture. It was clean but cold, like a room waiting for life to return to it. "It's perfect," Clara said softly. "There's no bedding.
No curtains.
The washstand needs repair. I can make curtains from flour sacks, and I have a quilt in my bag." She walked to the window and looked out at the prairie stretching endlessly toward the horizon. "It's peaceful here." "Lonely, you mean?" She turned to study his face. "Sometimes lonely and peaceful are the same thing. Sometimes we need quiet to figure out who we are when nobody else is watching." The observation was so unexpectedly wise that Ezra found himself really looking at her for the first time. Not just noting her shabby clothes and travel-worn appearance, but seeing the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone who'd learned to rely on no one but herself. "Why did you really come out here?" he asked. "You could find work in town. Safer work with nicer people." Clara was quiet for a long moment, still gazing out the window. "Because nice people ask questions I'm not ready to answer, and safe work doesn't pay enough to build a future on." She met his eyes. "And because Mrs. Patterson said you were a good man who'd lost his way. I know something about that." The honesty in her voice made something crack open in Ezra's chest. When was the last time someone had spoken to him without pity or judgment? When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen anything worth saving? "I should warn you," he said. "I'm not easy to live with these days. I forget to eat, forget to wash, forget to act like a civilized human being. And there are men in town who'd like to see me fail completely." "What kind of men?" "The kind who loan money to desperate people and then take everything when they can't pay it back." Clara nodded as if she understood perfectly. "Men like that think they own the world. But they only have power if we give it to them. Easy to say. Harder to do when they hold the papers on everything you love." "Maybe," she agreed. "But I've learned that sometimes the best way to fight wolves is to stop acting like prey." Before Ezra could ask what she meant by that, Clara picked up her carpetbag and moved toward the door. "I should get my things settled before dark. And you should finish that soup before it gets cold." She was right about the soup, but Ezra found himself reluctant to leave the room. Something had shifted in the last few minutes, some possibility he couldn't quite name but didn't want to lose. "Clara?" he called as she reached the main room. "Yes. Thank you. For coming out here, for taking a chance on." He gestured at himself, at the mess surrounding them. She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. "Thank you for giving me one." As she began unpacking her few belongings, humming softly under her breath, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of hopelessness. Like a door opening in a room he'd thought permanently sealed. What secrets was she carrying in that worn carpetbag? Mrs. Patterson's boots made angry sounds on the wooden porch as she marched toward Ezra's front door. Bang, bang, bang went her fist against the wood, each hit like a hammer striking metal. Inside the cabin, empty bottles rattled on the table from the force. "Ezra Callahan, open this door right now." Her voice cut through the morning air like a sharp knife. "I know you're in there feeling sorry for yourself." Ezra rolled off his bed and stumbled to the door. His shirt hung loose on his thin frame, and his hair stuck up in all directions. When he opened the door, sunlight hit his face and made him squint like a mole coming out of the ground. Mrs. Patterson took one look at him and shook her head. "Lord have mercy on your soul. You look worse than a scarecrow in a tornado." She pushed past him without waiting for permission. Her eyes moved around the cabin, taking in the dirty dishes piled high like a mountain, clothes scattered everywhere like fallen leaves, and dust so thick you could write your name in it. "When did you last eat a real meal?" she asked, picking up a moldy piece of bread with 2 fingers. Ezra scratched his beard. "Tuesday, I think. Maybe Monday." "What day is it now?" "Friday." Mrs. Patterson threw the bread into the trash bucket with a loud thunk. "It's Saturday, you fool. You've lost track of time completely." She walked to the window and threw open the curtains. Dust particles danced in the bright light like tiny spirits. "This place smells like a root cellar that's been closed for a year." Ezra sank into his father's old chair. The leather creaked under his weight. "What do you want, Mrs. Patterson? If you came to tell me the bank's taking the ranch, I already know. I came to offer you a lifeline, though I'm starting to wonder if you're too stubborn to grab it." She sat down across from him, smoothing her dark blue dress. Her gray hair was pulled back tight, and her brown eyes were serious but kind. "There's a girl in town named Clara Whitmore. Lost her whole family to the sickness last winter. Been doing washing and mending for folks. Sleeping in the church basement when Pastor Williams lets her." Ezra's head snapped up. "I don't need charity." "This isn't charity, it's business." Mrs. Patterson's voice got firmer. "She needs a place to work and live. You need someone to keep you from turning into a hermit who talks to himself." "I don't talk to myself." "Then who were you arguing with when I walked up?" "The mice." Ezra's face turned red. He had been having a conversation with his father's picture again, asking for advice about the bank notice. But he wasn't about to admit that to Mrs. Patterson. "She's just a kid," he said instead. "She's 22 and has more sense than you do right now. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. She can cook, clean, and she knows how to take care of animals. Grew up on a farm before her parents died. I can't pay much. She doesn't need much. Room, board, and $2 a week. That's less than you'd spend on whiskey if you had any money left. Ezra winced. She was right about the whiskey. He'd spent his last coins on a bottle 3 days ago, thinking it might help him sleep. Instead, it just made his problems look bigger and his solutions look smaller. What if it doesn't work out? He asked. Then you'll be exactly where you are now, except your cabin might be clean enough for the undertaker to work in when you finally give up completely. Mrs. Patterson stood up and walked to the mantel where his father's picture sat. She picked it up and wiped the dust off with her handkerchief. Your father was a good man, Ezra. He'd be sad to see what you've become. The words hit him like a slap. That's not fair. Fair. Mrs. Patterson set the picture down carefully. You think it was fair when that girl lost her parents and had to bury them by herself? You think it's fair that she's been living on scraps and charity while you sit here drowning in self-pity? She walked back to him and put her hand on his shoulder. Her touch was gentle but firm. Sometimes God sends us exactly what we need, but we're too proud or too scared to see it. This girl needs a chance and you need help. Maybe that's not a coincidence. Ezra looked around his cabin again. Really looked this time. The broken things, the dirty things, the sad things that had piled up like snow in winter. When had he stopped caring? When had he decided that giving up was easier than fighting? What's her name again? He asked quietly. Clara Whitmore. Red hair, green eyes, and a backbone made of steel. She'll work hard and won't complain. When can she start? Mrs. Patterson smiled for the first time since arriving. I'll bring her by this afternoon. You'd better take a bath and put on clean clothes. First impressions matter. After she left, Ezra sat in his chair for a long time. Outside, his cattle moved slowly across the dry grass, looking for something green to eat. A hawk circled overhead, riding the wind currents with its wings spread wide. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe he had been waiting for God to fix his problems instead of trying to fix them himself. And maybe this Clara girl was the help he'd been too proud to ask for. He stood up slowly and looked at his father's picture. What do you think, Pa? Should I take a chance on this? The picture didn't answer, but somehow Ezra felt like his father would have approved. His father had always said that the best way to help yourself was to help someone else first. For the first time in months, Ezra walked to the wash basin and began to clean himself up. If Clara Whitmore was coming to help save his home, the least he could do was make sure he looked like a man worth saving. The sun was starting to set behind the mountains when Clara Whitmore stepped down from Mrs. Patterson's wagon. Her brown traveling dress was patched in 3 places, but it was clean and pressed. She carried everything she owned in a small leather bag that had seen better years. Ezra watched from his bedroom window as she stood in his yard, looking up at the cabin. Even from a distance, he could see her taking in every detail: the sagging porch, the broken fence posts, the weeds growing where his mother's garden used to be. Mrs. Patterson said something to Clara and pointed toward the front door. Clara nodded and picked up her bag. She walked with her back straight and her head up, like a soldier marching into battle. Ezra's stomach felt like it was full of jumping frogs. He'd cleaned himself up as much as possible, putting on his best shirt and combing his hair with water. But he still felt nervous about meeting this girl who was supposed to help save his life. 3 soft knocks came at the door. Not the angry banging Mrs. Patterson had used, but polite taps that sounded almost musical. When Ezra opened the door, the first thing he noticed was Clara's eyes. They were green like new spring grass, but there was something old in them, like she'd seen things no young person should see. Mr. Callahan? Her voice was soft but clear.
I'm Clara Whitmore.
Mrs. Patterson said you might have work for me. She was smaller than he'd expected, barely reaching his shoulder. Her red hair was braided and pinned up neatly, with little curls escaping around her face. Her hands were folded in front of her, and he could see calluses on her palms. Yes, miss. Please, come in. Clara stepped inside and set her bag down carefully by the door. Her eyes moved around the room, but her face didn't change expression. She didn't wrinkle her nose at the smell or gasp at the mess like Mrs. Patterson had done. It's a good cabin, she said simply. Strong bones. Just needs some care. Ezra felt surprised by her words. Most people would have focused on what was wrong with the place. Clara seemed to see what was right with it. Can you cook? He asked, then felt foolish for being so direct. Yes, sir. My mother taught me before she got sick. I can make bread, stew, biscuits, and pie if you have the ingredients. What about cleaning? I've been keeping house since I was 12. I know how to wash clothes, scrub floors, and mend things that are torn. And you're not afraid of hard work? Something flickered across her face, a shadow of memory or pain. I've done harder work than this, Mr. Callahan. Much harder. There was a story behind those words, but Ezra didn't feel right asking about it yet. Instead, he showed her around the cabin, pointing out the kitchen area, the sitting room, and the small bedroom off the back that would be hers. Clara's room was barely bigger than a closet, with just a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out toward the barn. The bed had no sheets, and the dresser was covered in dust. I know it's not much, Ezra said, feeling embarrassed. It has 4 walls and a roof, Clara replied. That's more than I've had some nights. She set her bag on the bed and opened it. Inside, Ezra caught glimpses of a few folded dresses, a small Bible, and what looked like a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. What would you like me to start with? She asked. Ezra looked around the main room again. Where should she even begin? Everything needed attention. Maybe the kitchen? I haven't had a decent meal in a long time. Clara nodded and rolled up her sleeves. Do you have any food in the house? Ezra opened the cupboard and showed her what was left. A bag of flour with weevils in it, some salt, a few potatoes that were starting to sprout, and a jar of preserves his neighbor had given him months ago. I'll need to go to town tomorrow for supplies, Clara said. But I can make something with this tonight. She threw out the bad flour and washed the potatoes in the bucket of water by the sink. As she worked, she hummed a tune Ezra didn't recognize. The sound filled the cabin with something it had been missing for years, the presence of life, of hope, of someone who cared enough to make things better. Mrs. Patterson said you lost your family, Ezra said, then immediately wished he hadn't.
I'm sorry.
That's not my business. Clara's hands stilled for a moment. It's all right. Yes, I lost them. Consumption took my parents and my little brother last winter. I was the only one who didn't get sick. That must have been hard. It was. She started peeling potatoes again. But I learned something important. Sitting around feeling sorry for yourself doesn't bring back the dead or fix what's broken. Her words hit Ezra like a cold wind. How long had he been sitting around feeling sorry for himself? How many days had he wasted wishing things were different instead of trying to make them different? You're right, he said quietly. Clara looked at him with those old, wise eyes. We all have to grieve, Mr. Callahan. But there comes a time when you have to choose between staying buried with the dead or fighting to live with the living. She sliced the potatoes and put them in the big iron pan. From somewhere in her bag, she produced a small cloth bundle that contained herbs and spices. How did you know to bring those? Ezra asked. A good cook always travels prepared. She sprinkled something over the potatoes that made them smell like heaven. My grandmother taught me that. As Clara worked, Ezra found himself watching her movements. She was efficient but not hurried, careful but not fussy. Everything she did seemed to serve a purpose. Why did you agree to come here? He asked. Mrs. Patterson must have told you about my situation. Clara stirred the potatoes with a wooden spoon. She told me you were a man who'd lost his way. She also told me you were basically good, just hurting. And you believed her? I believed the part about you hurting. I can see that in your eyes. Clara looked at him directly. As for the rest, I figured I'd find out for myself. What if you decide I'm not worth helping? Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking about her answer. Everyone is worth helping, Mr. Callahan. The question is whether they're ready to help themselves. The potatoes were starting to brown and smell incredible. Ezra's stomach growled loudly, and Clara smiled. The first real smile he'd seen from her. When did you last eat? She asked. This morning. Had some stale bread. Before that, Ezra tried to remember. Maybe Thursday. Clara shook her head and added more seasoning to the pan. Well, we'll start fixing that tonight. A man can't think straight when he's hungry. As the sun finished setting outside, Clara lit the oil lamp on the kitchen table. The warm light made the cabin feel cozier somehow, like a real home instead of just a place where someone happened to sleep. Mr. Callahan, Clara said as she served the potatoes onto 2 plates. I want you to know something. I'm not here to fix your problems. I'm here to help you fix them yourself. She set a plate in front of him, and the smell made his mouth water. What's the difference? The difference is that when I leave someday, you'll still know how to take care of yourself. The words, when I leave, hit Ezra harder than he expected. He'd just met this girl, but already the thought of her leaving made the cabin feel empty again. But as he took his first bite of the best potatoes he'd tasted in years, Ezra realized something important. Clara Whitmore hadn't just come to clean his house. She'd come to help him remember how to live. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly the miracle he'd been praying for. Clara's scream pierced the morning air like a knife through silk. Ezra dropped his coffee cup and ran toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found her in the kitchen, pressed against the wall, staring at something on the floor with wide, terrified eyes. A spider, just a common house spider, no bigger than a button. I'm sorry, Clara whispered, her face red with shame. I'm so sorry. I know it's foolish, but I can't. I just can't. Ezra gently scooped up the spider with a piece of paper and carried it outside. When he came back, Clara was sitting at the table, her hands shaking like autumn leaves. Everyone's afraid of something, he said quietly, sitting across from her. My pa was scared of thunderstorms. Big man like him, and he'd hide in the root cellar every time the sky got dark. Clara looked up at him with surprise. Really? Really? Said it started when he was a boy. Lightning struck his family's barn, burned everything to the ground. Ezra poured her fresh coffee from the pot. Fear doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human. Something in Clara's shoulders relaxed. She wrapped her fingers around the warm cup and took a small sip. There were spiders in the place where we lived after we lost the farm. Hundreds of them. Black widows mostly. They'd crawl across my face while I slept. The words came out in a rush, like water through a broken dam. Ezra didn't interrupt, just listened as she told him about the abandoned house where she and her parents had taken shelter. How her father had gotten so sick he couldn't work. How her mother had sold everything they owned, piece by piece, just to buy medicine that didn't help. I used to lie awake at night, feeling them crawl over me, Clara continued. But I couldn't move, couldn't make noise, because Mama was finally sleeping and she needed the rest so badly. Ezra felt something tight and angry coil in his chest. Not at Clara, but at a world that could put a young girl through such things. How old were you? 15 when we lost the farm. 16 when they died. Clara's voice was steady now, like she'd found solid ground again. Mrs. Patterson found me sleeping in the church 6 months later. I'd been living on scraps and charity, doing whatever work I could find. And now you're here, Ezra said. And now I'm here. Clara met his eyes, and he saw something new there. Not just trust, but hope. Strange how life works, isn't it? All those terrible things happened, but they led me to this place. To you. The rest of the morning passed differently than the others had. Clara still worked, washing clothes, sweeping floors, preparing meals, but now she hummed while she did it. Real songs with words, not just melodies. Old hymns her mother had taught her, and folk songs that made Ezra's chest feel warm. Around noon, She disappeared into the garden behind the house. Ezra found her there an hour later, on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from around the struggling vegetables with careful hands. "You don't have to do that," he said. "The garden's pretty much a lost cause this year." "Nothing's ever a lost cause," Clara replied without looking up. "These tomatoes just need someone to believe in them again." She worked in the garden every day after that. While Ezra tended the cattle or fixed fence posts, Clara coaxed life from the stubborn earth. She found seeds in the barn, packets his father had saved years ago, and planted them in neat rows. She carried water in buckets from the well, talking to the plants like they were old friends. "You think I'm crazy," she said one evening, catching him watching her from the porch. "No," Ezra said, and meant it. "I think you see possibilities where other people see problems." Clara smiled at that, dirt smudged on her cheek and satisfaction in her eyes. "My mama always said the best gardens grow in the hardest ground. Said struggle makes the roots go deep." That night, Ezra found himself lying awake, listening to the sounds of another person in his house. Not just the breathing and shifting that meant he wasn't alone, but the small sounds of someone making a home. Clara had hung curtains in her room, made from old feed sacks, but they let in just the right amount of morning light. She'd arranged wildflowers on the kitchen table and swept the corners where dust had lived so long it seemed like part of the furniture. But it was more than the physical changes. The house felt different now, like it was remembering how to be alive again, like it was remembering its purpose. 3 weeks passed before Ezra realized the change in himself. He'd started shaving every morning instead of once a week. He'd mended the loose board on the front step that had been bothering him for months. He found himself looking forward to meals, not just because the food was better, but because it meant sitting across from Clara, listening to her stories, sharing his own. She had a way of drawing things out of him, memories he'd thought buried, dreams he'd convinced himself were foolish. She listened like every word mattered, asked questions that made him think about his life in new ways. "What would you do if money wasn't a problem?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. "I don't know," Ezra said honestly. "Been so long since I thought about wanting instead of just surviving." "Think about it now," Clara urged. "If you could do anything, be anything, what would it be?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I'd like to breed horses," he said finally. "Good ones. The kind that know their job and take pride in doing it well. Pa always said there was nothing finer than a horse that wanted to work with you instead of against you. So why don't you? Takes money to start something like that. Good bloodstock, proper facilities." Ezra shrugged. "Takes time I don't have and resources I can't spare." "But it's not impossible," Clara pressed. "Just difficult, I suppose." "Then it's worth thinking about," she said firmly. "Dreams don't cost anything to keep alive." Later, as Ezra prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about horses again for the first time in years. Not the broken-down cattle ponies he owned now, but the kind of animals his father had dreamed of raising. Strong, intelligent, beautiful creatures that would make their mark on the world. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe some dreams were worth keeping alive, even when they seemed impossible. Maybe especially then. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat and whose eyes held the kind of urgency that made Ezra's stomach drop. "You Ezra Callahan?" the man asked, not bothering to dismount. "I am. Got word from town. Bank examiners coming through next week. They're calling in all the outstanding loans, checking every account." The rider pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Thought you should know." After the man rode away, Ezra stood in his yard holding the letter like it might bite him. Clara appeared at his elbow, drying her hands on her apron. "Bad news?" she asked. "The worst kind." Ezra's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Bank examiner means they're looking for reasons to foreclose. Any excuse to take the property." Clara was quiet for a moment, studying his face. "How much time do we have?" The way she said we made something warm bloom in Ezra's chest, even in the middle of his panic. A week, maybe less. Then we have a week to figure it out, Clara said with the kind of calm certainty that made impossible things seem manageable. Come on, let's look at the books. They spent the afternoon hunched over his father's old ledger, adding and subtracting figures that never seemed to add up right. No matter how they arranged the numbers, the truth remained. Ezra owed more than he could pay, and his cattle weren't worth enough to cover the debt. What about selling some land? Clara suggested. Bank holds the title. Can't sell what I don't own. Ezra rubbed his eyes, feeling older than his 28 years. Pa put everything into this place. Borrowed against future harvests that never came. Counted on cattle prices that fell through the floor. So we find another way, Clara said simply. Clara, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. She closed the ledger with a firm snap. I understand that giving up is easy, and fighting is hard, and you've been fighting alone for so long you've forgotten what it feels like to have help. That evening, Clara surprised him by producing a small cloth bag from her room. She set it on the kitchen table between them and untied the strings with careful fingers. Inside were coins, silver dollars mostly, but some gold pieces too. More money than Ezra had seen in one place for years. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been saving since I was 16, Clara said. Every penny from every job, every coin I could spare. I told myself it was for someday, when I found a place to belong. Ezra stared at the money, understanding what she was offering and what it meant. Clara, I can't take this. It's everything you have. No, she said quietly. Everything I have is sitting across this table from me. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross before. Ezra felt his heart do something complicated in his chest, part gratitude and part terror and part something else entirely. You'd risk everything for this place? For me. I'd risk everything for us, Clara corrected. For what we're building here. That night, Ezra lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Clara move around in the next room. She was packing, he realized, not to leave but to make space for the changes coming. He heard her humming again, but this time the melody was different. Sadder, maybe, but also determined. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Mrs. Patterson arrived with the preacher in tow, both wearing the kind of serious expressions that usually preceded funerals or interventions. Ezra Callahan, Mrs. Patterson announced without preamble. We need to talk. They sat in the parlor, a room Ezra had forgotten existed until Clara had cleaned and arranged it, drinking coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of bitter water. Word's gotten around about your troubles, the preacher said gently. About the bank examiner coming. And, Ezra asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. And the town's taken a collection, Mrs. Patterson said, producing a heavy envelope from her bag. Not charity, mind you. Investment. Lot of folks remember your father, remember what he did for this community. Figure it's time to return the favor. Ezra opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was enough money to make a significant dent in his debt, though not enough to clear it entirely. I don't know what to say, he managed. Say you'll fight, Mrs. Patterson replied. Say you'll keep this place running and prove that good people still have a chance in this world. After they left, Clara found Ezra in the barn, sitting on a hay bale with his head in his hands. Overwhelming, isn't it? She said, settling beside him. Having people believe in you when you've stopped believing in yourself. I don't deserve this, Ezra said. Any of it. The money, the support, you. Stop. Clara's voice was sharp enough to cut through his self-pity. Just stop. You think deserve has anything to do with it? You think I deserve to lose my family? Or you deserve to watch your dreams crumble? Ezra looked at her, startled by the fire in her voice. Life isn't about deserving, Clara continued. It's about taking what comes and deciding what to do with it. And what's coming is a chance. Maybe our only chance. to build something good from all this mess. She stood up, brushing hay from her skirt. The question isn't whether you deserve it. The question is what you're going to do with it. That afternoon, they rode into town together, the first time Ezra had left the ranch in weeks. Clara sat beside him on the wagon seat, her hair tied back with a blue ribbon that matched her dress. People stared as they passed, some with curiosity, others with something that might have been approval. At the bank, they met with Mr. Henderson, a thin man with kind eyes who'd known Ezra's father. Combined with what you already have, this should be enough to satisfy the examiner, Henderson said after counting their money. Not enough to clear the debt entirely, but enough to show good faith, buy you time to get back on your feet. Walking out of the bank, Ezra felt lighter than he had in months. Not free, not yet, but no longer drowning. Beside him, Clara moved with quiet satisfaction, like someone who just solved a difficult puzzle. What now? Ezra asked as they climbed back onto the wagon. Now we go home, Clara said simply, and we start building the life we want instead of just surviving the one we have. Thought about it. She pictured Webb's cold eyes and cruel smile, pictured the kind of life he had planned for her. Then she pictured the alternative, another train to another town, another round of begging for work from strangers who saw her as a burden to be avoided. Especially then, she said finally, because if I run now, he wins. And I'm done letting men like Marcus Webb decide what my life looks like. Something shifted in Ezra's expression, surprise, maybe, or recognition. You could get hurt, killed even. So could you. Clara reached out and touched his hand where it gripped the pitchfork. But we're stronger together than either of us is alone. Don't you see that? For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn doors and carrying the scent of rain from the gathering storm clouds. Clara could hear the cattle lowing in the distance, settling in for what promised to be a rough night. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I haven't told you. Ezra went very still. What? Clara took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything between them. I have money. Not much, but some. Enough to make a payment on the mortgage, maybe buy us some time.
Clara, no.
I can't take your money. You're not taking it. I'm offering it. There's a difference. She squeezed his hand. It's not charity, Ezra. It's investment. In this place. In us. The last word slipped out before she could stop it, hanging in the air between them like a promise waiting to be kept. Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she didn't take it back. Us. Ezra's voice was barely above a whisper. If there is an us. Clara's heart hammered so hard she was sure he could hear it. If you want there to be. For the longest moment of her life, Ezra just stared at her. Then, slowly, carefully, he set down the pitchfork and reached up to cup her face in his calloused hands. Clara Whitmore, he said softly, you are the most stubborn, brave, impossible woman I've ever met. Is that a yes or a no? His answer came in the form of a kiss, gentle at first, then deeper as she melted against him. When they finally broke apart, Clara felt dizzy with possibility. It's a yes, he whispered against her forehead. To all of it. The money, the fight, the us. All of it. Outside, thunder rumbled across the prairie. But inside the barn, two people who had found each other in the darkness were finally stepping into the light. So what's our next move? Clara asked. Ezra smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since Webb's visit. First, we make that payment. Then we start building something worth defending. Together. Together. As if summoned by their words, the first drops of rain began pattering against the barn roof. But neither Clara nor Ezra moved to leave their shelter. They had plans to make, a future to fight for, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, hope felt like something more than just a pretty word. The crack of gunshots shattered the morning silence like glass hitting stone. Clara dropped the bucket of chicken feed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she counted the shots. 3 quick pops from somewhere near the creek. Ezra never fired his gun unless something was seriously wrong. She grabbed the rifle from beside the kitchen door and ran toward the sound, her boots slipping on the dew-wet grass. The autumn air bit at her cheeks as she crested the small hill behind their cabin. What she saw below made her blood turn to ice water. Ezra knelt beside one of their cattle, a young heifer that had been healthy just yesterday. Now the animal lay still, 3 bullet holes dark against its brown hide. Standing over both man and beast was Marcus Webb, his black coat making him look like a vulture against the pale morning sky. "Shame about your cow, Callahan," Webb said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet morning. "Coyote's been getting bold lately. Might get bolder if folks don't pay their debts on time." 2 other men flanked Webb, strangers with hard faces and guns hanging loose in their holsters. Clara recognized the type from her days traveling between towns. Men who hurt people for money and slept fine afterward. Ezra stood slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You shot my cow. Now that's a serious charge," Webb replied, examining his fingernails like they were the most interesting thing in the world. "Got any proof? These men here will swear they saw coyotes running off when we rode up." The 2 gunmen nodded, their faces blank as winter stones. Clara felt anger rise in her throat like bitter medicine. This was how Webb worked, always just inside the law, always with witnesses ready to lie for him. She'd heard the stories in town. Mysterious accidents that happened to people who crossed him. Animals that died from illness. Barns that burned down on windy nights. "What do you want, Webb?" Ezra's voice was steady, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. Simple business discussion. Webb pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "New terms for your loan. Seems the banks decided you're a poor risk. They want full payment by the end of this week, not the end of the month like we talked about before." The paper crackled as Webb unfolded it. Even from her hiding spot on the hill, Clara could see official-looking seals and fancy writing. "That's not legal," Ezra said. "We had an agreement. Agreements change when circumstances change." Webb's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "Like when a man starts keeping expensive women around. Makes folks wonder where he's getting money for luxuries." Clara's cheeks burned hot. Webb was talking about her like she was some fancy lady from the city, not a woman who worked from dawn to dusk keeping their small ranch running. "Clara earns her keep and more," Ezra shot back. "She's got nothing to do with this." "Oh, but she does." Webb took a step closer, and Clara saw Ezra's hand move toward his gun. "See, I've been thinking. Pretty girl like that could work off your debt real nice. I know men in town who'd pay good money for her company." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd heard whispers about what happened to women who couldn't pay their own debts to men like Webb. They disappeared into saloons and worse places, never to be seen again by decent folks. Ezra's gun cleared its holster so fast Clara barely saw the movement. The barrel pointed steady at Webb's chest, and for a moment nobody breathed. "You'll not speak of her that way again," Ezra said, his voice quiet and deadly. "Not ever." Webb laughed, the sound echoing off the hills like rocks falling. "Big talk from a man who can't even protect his cattle. You really want to point that gun at me, Callahan? Think real careful about what happens next." The 2 hired guns shifted their weight, hands moving to rest on their own weapons. Clara could see how this would end, 3 against 1, with Ezra in the middle of an open field. No cover, no help, no chance. She stood up slowly, making sure they could all see her and the rifle she carried. "Good morning, Mr. Webb," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear dancing in her stomach. "Beautiful day for visiting, isn't it?" All 4 men turned toward her voice. Webb's face darkened when he saw the rifle aimed in his general direction. "Well, well," he said, "the little woman wants to play with the big boys." "I'm not playing," Clara replied, walking down the hill with careful steps. She kept the rifle pointed toward the ground, but ready to lift it quickly if needed. "Just wondering what business brings you to our ranch so early in the morning." "Our ranch?" Webb's eyebrows shot up. Last I checked, Miss Whitmore, your name wasn't on any papers. You're just the hired help. Actually, Clara said, reaching into her apron pocket with her free hand, there's been a change in that situation. She pulled out a piece of paper. Not fancy like Webb's, but official enough. The marriage license she and Ezra had gotten in town 3 days ago. Signed and sealed by Judge Morrison himself. Webb's face went through several colors as he read the paper. Red, then white, then a dangerous purple that made Clara think of thunderclouds. You got married, he said, his voice flat with surprise. Yesterday afternoon, Clara confirmed. Which makes this our ranch, Mr. Webb. Both of ours together. The silence stretched tight as fence wire. Clara could hear her own heartbeat and the distant sound of wind through the grass. One of Webb's men shifted nervously, his horse dancing sideways under him. Doesn't change the debt? Webb finally said, but some of the swagger had gone out of his voice. No, Ezra agreed, holstering his gun but keeping his hand close to it. But it changes other things, like who you're dealing with now. Webb looked back and forth between them, and Clara could see him trying to figure out his next move. A single woman with no family was easy prey. A married woman with a husband who could shoot straight was a different problem entirely. This isn't over, Webb said finally, folding up his paper with sharp, angry movements. Married or not, you still owe money you don't have. I'll be back at the end of the week for payment in full. He mounted his horse with the fluid grace of a man who'd been riding since childhood. And if I can't get money, he added, looking directly at Clara, I'll find other ways to collect. The threat hung in the air like smoke as the 3 riders headed back toward town, leaving dust and the dead cow behind them. Clara walked to Ezra's side, close enough to feel the warmth from his body in the cool morning air. Well, she said, looking down at the poor heifer. That could have gone worse. Ezra turned to stare at her, his eyes wide with something between amazement and panic. Clara, what did we just do? She looked at the marriage license still in her hand, then at the man beside her who'd been willing to die protecting her honor. I think, she said slowly, we just made our problems twice as big and twice as complicated. Any regrets? He asked. Clara thought about Webb's threats, about the impossible debt, about the long hard winter coming and all the ways their situation had just gotten more dangerous. Then she looked at Ezra, really looked at him, and saw a man worth fighting beside. Ask me again in a week, she said, when we see if we're still alive to worry about it. The kitchen felt smaller with secrets hanging in the air like smoke from a badly drawing chimney. Clara sat at the wooden table where they ate their meals, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from her, Ezra stared at the marriage license like it might suddenly burst into flames. We need to talk about what happens next, he said finally, his voice careful and quiet. Webb wasn't bluffing about that debt. I owe him more money than this ranch makes in 2 good years. Clara nodded, though her stomach felt like it was full of jumping grasshoppers. How much more? The number Ezra spoke made her gasp out loud. It was more money than she'd ever seen in her whole life, more than most people in their county made in 5 years of hard work. That's impossible, she whispered. How did it get so high? Ezra's face flushed red with shame. Interest. Penalties for late payments. More interest on top of that. He pushed his hands through his hair, making it stick up in all directions. My father borrowed the original money to buy cattle after a bad winter killed most of his herd. I thought I could pay it back when times got better. But times didn't get better. Times got worse. Much worse. Ezra stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land that might not be theirs much longer. 3 years of drought. Cattle prices falling through the floor. And Webb just kept adding fees and charges every time I couldn't make a full payment. Clara felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Anger at Webb for being a greedy snake. Sadness for Ezra, who'd tried so hard to save his father's dream. And underneath it all, a growing determination that surprised her with its strength. There might be another way, she said slowly. Ezra turned from the window. What do you mean? Clara stood and walked to her small bedroom. Their bedroom now, she supposed, though they hadn't talked about those kinds of arrangements yet. From under the loose floorboard beside her narrow bed, she pulled out a cloth bag that clinked softly when she moved it. Back in the kitchen, she poured the contents onto the table. Gold coins caught the lamplight, along with several crumpled bills and a small roll of silver dollars. Not a fortune by any means, but more money than Ezra had expected to see. Where did this come from? He asked, his voice full of wonder and something that might have been worry. My family, Clara said simply. Before the sickness took them, my father sold our farm to a man from back east who wanted to try ranching. Pa didn't trust banks, so he kept the money hidden in our house. She picked up one of the gold coins, turning it over in her fingers. When I left home after the funeral, I took what I could carry. Been saving it ever since, thinking maybe someday I'd have a place to settle down again. Ezra stared at the money like it might bite him. Clara, I can't take your family's money. It's all you have left of them. No, she said firmly. What I have left of them is their love, and their lessons about working hard and helping people when you can. This money won't bring them back, but it might save what we're trying to build here. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. Clara could see Ezra fighting with himself, his pride warring against his desperate need for help. It's not enough, he said finally. Even with all this, we'd still owe Webb more than we could pay. Then we don't pay Webb. Ezra's head snapped up. What? Clara had been thinking about this since Webb rode away that morning, an idea growing in her mind like a seed in good soil. What if we paid the bank directly? Webb isn't the real owner of your debt. He just bought it from them when you couldn't pay. Banks care about getting their money back, not about making people suffer. Banks don't usually negotiate. This one might. Clara sat down again, leaning forward with excitement. Mrs. Patterson told me her brother works at the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne. She said they've been losing money on too many foreclosures. When they take people's land, they usually can't sell it for what they're owed. Ezra's eyes widened as he began to understand what she was suggesting. You think they'd take less money if we paid it all at once? I think they'd rather get half their money back right away than maybe get all of it back sometime never. Clara reached across the table and took his hands in hers. It's worth trying, isn't it? The hope in Ezra's face was beautiful and terrible to see. Beautiful because it transformed his whole expression. Terrible because Clara knew how much it would hurt him if her plan didn't work. Even if the bank agreed, he said slowly, that would leave us with almost nothing. No money for seed, for feed, for repairs. How would we survive the winter? Clara had been thinking about that too. Mrs. Patterson also mentioned something else. Her nephew runs a freight company out of Laramie. They're always looking for reliable people to deliver supplies to remote ranches during the winter months. That's dangerous work. Long rides in bad weather, through country where road agents might be waiting. But it pays well, Clara pointed out. Well enough to keep us going until spring, when we could plant crops again. Ezra was quiet for a long time, staring at their joined hands on the table. Clara could almost see the thoughts racing through his mind, weighing possibilities and risks. There's something else we need to talk about, he said finally. About us. About what this marriage means. Clara's heart did a little skip in her chest. They'd gotten married to protect her from Webb and to strengthen their legal position regarding the ranch. But sitting here in the lamplight, making plans for their future, it felt like something much more real than a paper arrangement. What about us? She asked softly. I don't want you to feel trapped, Ezra said, his voice earnest and worried. When we went to Judge Morrison, it was about survival, about protecting you and saving the ranch. But now, he paused, searching for the right words. Now I'm realizing that somewhere along the way, my feelings got involved. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest like sunshine after a long winter. What kind of feelings? The kind that make a man want to be better than he is, Ezra replied. The kind that make him think about building something that lasts longer than one season. The honesty in his voice made Clara's throat tight with emotion. Ezra, I know it's not fair to put that on you, he continued quickly. You didn't sign up for a real marriage, just a legal one. If you want to keep things the way they've been, separate rooms, business arrangements, I'll understand. Clara looked at this man who'd been willing to face down armed thugs to protect her honor, who worried more about her feelings than his own desperate circumstances. She thought about the weeks they'd spent learning to live together, the way he listened when she talked about her nightmares, the careful gentleness he showed when she was scared. What if I told you, she said carefully, that my feelings got involved too? The smile that spread across Ezra's face was like sunrise after the darkest night. Then I'd say we might have a chance at something pretty wonderful, if we're brave enough to try for it. Clara squeezed his hands tighter. I'm tired of being afraid, she said. Afraid of losing people, afraid of caring too much, afraid of hoping for things that might not work out. Maybe it's time to be brave instead. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter was coming fast. They had impossible debts to settle, dangerous work to consider, and a future that was anything but certain. But inside their small kitchen, with lamplight dancing on gold coins and hope growing between them like a bridge finally completed, they began to believe that together they might be strong enough to build something worth keeping. So what do we do first? Ezra asked. Clara looked at the money on the table, then at the man who'd become her partner in every sense of the word. First, she said, we ride to Cheyenne and make the bank an offer they can't refuse. The gunshot shattered the morning air just as Clara pinned the last wildflower in her hair. She froze at her bedroom window, watching 3 riders charge toward the cabin with dust clouds billowing behind them like storm warnings. Today was supposed to be her wedding day. Today was supposed to be perfect. Ezra, she called, grabbing her rifle from beside the dresser. But when she reached the main room, Ezra was already at the window with his own gun ready. His jaw was set tight, and his knuckles were white around the rifle stock. It's not Webb this time, he said quietly. It's the sheriff. Clara's heart dropped like a stone into deep water. Sheriff Morrison only made house calls when someone was in serious trouble. The kind of trouble that could destroy everything they'd built together. The riders stopped just outside the fence. Sheriff Morrison climbed down from his horse slowly, like a man carrying bad news. Behind him, 2 deputies stayed mounted with their hands resting on their gun handles. Callahan, the sheriff called. Need to have a word with you. Ezra looked at Clara in her mother's white dress, at the wildflowers in her hair, at the hope shining in her eyes despite the fear. Stay inside, he whispered. But Clara had already made up her mind. She'd spent too many months running from trouble. Today she would face it head-on. They walked out together, hand in hand, and Clara saw the sheriff's eyes widen when he noticed her wedding dress. Well, this is awkward timing, Morrison said, taking off his hat. Afraid I've got some business that can't wait. What kind of business? Ezra asked. The sheriff pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. Got a warrant here. Says Clara Whitmore is wanted for theft back in Colorado. Says she stole money from the family she worked for before coming here. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The Morrison family. She'd worked for them for 3 months, cleaning their big house and caring for their sick daughter. When little Emma died, Mrs. Morrison had blamed Clara, saying she hadn't done enough to save the child. That's not true, Clara said, her voice stronger than she felt. Maybe not, the sheriff replied. But I've got orders to bring you back for questioning. Judge will sort out the truth. Ezra stepped forward, putting himself between Clara and the sheriff. She's not going anywhere. Today's our wedding day. I'm sorry, son. I really am. But the law's the law. Clara squeezed Ezra's hand, feeling their dreams crumbling like dry leaves. After everything they'd survived together, it would end like this, with her in chains, branded as a thief. How much money are they saying I took? She asked. $50. Clara almost laughed. $50 was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. The Morrison family knew that. They were using the law to punish her for something that wasn't her fault. I can prove she didn't take it, Ezra said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. Clara held her breath. How's that? Morrison asked. Ezra pointed to the cabin behind them. She's been here for 4 months. Mrs. Patterson brought her straight from the church to my place. Never had a chance to steal anything from anybody in Colorado. That's not what the timeline in this warrant says. Then somebody's lying. The sheriff studied the paper again, frowning. Clara could see him thinking, weighing the evidence against the man he'd known for years. I'll tell you what, Morrison said finally. I'll wire back to Colorado, check the dates. If Mrs. Patterson can confirm when the girl arrived here, and if it matches what you're saying, then maybe we can sort this out without a trip. Relief flooded through Clara like cool water on a hot day. Mrs. Patterson keeps careful records of everyone she helps. She'll have the exact date written down. Good enough, the sheriff said. But until I hear back, you don't leave this property. Understood. Clara nodded quickly. Anything was better than jail. After the sheriff and his men rode away, Clara and Ezra stood on their porch in stunned silence.